recent survey by Truth About Youth found that 90% of young people today feel uncomfortable with the way they are portrayed in the media. As a charity devoted to changing negative perceptions of young people, we wanted to find out if this is a new trend or whether it has always been an issue. Starting from the 1950s, when the term teenager was first coined, we wanted to get the personal views of people who grew up in each decade, from then to now. Through interviews and chats with these people, we have built up a picture of how media representation has changed, and how it has stayed the same. As 80% of young people feel that adults are more wary of them now than they had been a year ago, we also wanted to explore how older generations view the youths of today, and how they felt about how society saw them when they were young.
So youth is positive, youths is very negative.
So in the 1950s, we're talking about the post-war period, and the most prominent subcultures that emerged were those of teddy boys. So these were kind of almost like Elvis type clones, and I think what we see here is an early moment that we would now probably call globalization, but it was really a kind of a form of Americanization where British youth were looking across to the States, and you saw the rise of what was called the teenager, somebody that had money to spend. Because if you imagine in the 1950s, there was a low level of population after the war, and there were lots of jobs. So young people could move into a job, get a job, and choose to do another one if they got fired or just felt like they wanted to leave it. So they suddenly had money and spending power.
I was a teddy boy.
You remember the red shorts?
No, teddy boys.
Oh,
They
yes,
wore
aye.
what they called beetle crusher
Oh, yes, aye.
shoes. The soles were that thick.
Crepe soles.
Crepe soles.
So what was chain on?
Drain pipe trousers. The long jacket.
Think the trousers?
Sideburns.
Think the trousers?
Yeah, with a velvet collar.
Velvet. Oh, that have a velvet
Aye.
trouser.
From
The
that.
DA, do you remember the DA at the back of the head?
Duck's ass.
Yeah.
Well,
No,
that's
you
what
shouldn't
it
be
was
saying
called.
that. But it's where you used to comb your hair back while the hair's still there. But,
Brill cream.
yeah,
Brill
brill
cream
cream.
down there.
But you used to get a line down the back
Where
of the hair.
both you know,
Like a swan's bone.
It's like a swan's bone. It's the
Oh,
DA,
the
what we used to
DA.
call a DA. Alright. And you used to have the, you know, the cravats and the velvet collars.
the men, when I was a
yeah.
teenager, when they went out, they were as smart as what the women were
Oh, aye.
with the dress. Because
When
they
you
had the
used to-
shirts
when you used to
on
go out-
and shoestring ties.
Yeah,
And
right.
that, you know, they were
Yeah,
all
well,
hair
it used to be
immaculate.
the shoestrings. I used to have one that had, I used to have a skull and crossbone,
Uh-huh.
and all it did was, it was a badge you put there and you fed it through, and that was the tie.
That was the tie.
But
yeah.
the trousers, you used to have to put Vaseline on your legs to actually
Get
get
them
them
on.
on.
They were
They were
really
that
tight.
tight.
Just as a matter of interest, have you found anything about teddy girls?
That's a really good question, because a lot of youth researchers omitted looking at girls until the late 70s, really. So girls were under-recognised, and when people talked about youth, they basically meant male youth. So it actually, girls were largely invisible.
12 schoolboys go on strike because they say they resent the harsh discipline of their school. Many of us will remember our school days and cherish the moments when we dared to challenge authority. Things seemed to happen more quickly in those days. Certainly retribution did. Of course, that's old-fashioned in these days of trying to understand the teenager, of even aping the teenager, worshipping at the shrine of the youthful and trying to fight off middle age. Let us be under no illusion about what these youngsters are like. They have threatened to turn cars over, it is said, outside this very school, and housewives have been sufficiently frightened to dial 999.
The most famous subculture in the 60s is the hippie culture, and of course there were female hippies as well as male hippies, and they were seen as a kind of counterculture in the sense that their values seemed to rub up against the norms of society. So males growing their hair long, being into peace, flower power, drugs, dropping out. This was all seen by the state as like terrible behaviour because it didn't fit with those kind of norms. So establishing alternative communities, ways of living and ideas was challenging what had gone before for that generation that had been through the war.
I started off when I was a young teenager wanting to be a rocker. My grandmother bought me a leather jacket which I found out eventually was plastic, but I wore that for a bit. I had a leather jacket and a pair of blue jeans when I was probably 13 or 14. When the Beatles and the Rolling Stones came along, that led to my generation being a little bit more, eventually it led to the rise of the hippies. I tried to be a hippie for a while, but I was still living at home with my mum and dad, and my father wouldn't allow me to have particularly long hair, after which I had it all cut off and became a kind of cheapo version of a skinhead.
Born in 1951, I became a teenager in 1964, and there was a lot of revolution going on, which I quite liked. I was brought up in a strict environment, so anything that sort of snubbed that strictness, I was quite happy with, yeah. So I started listening to music, especially what they would call nowadays hippie music, Bob Dylan, that sort of person, but got more into the likes of Jimi Hendrix, and the fact that playing guitar seemed to be a good way to get through the teenage years. I think music got me through some really, really bad times. As a teenager, you just think everyone's against you, the whole world's against you. And I used to in particular like to sing protest songs against war and violence. And my father was a sergeant major in the army, so it didn't quite go down very well. But I probably did that because my father was in the army. So.
Hippies were probably seen as people that were radical, were on the edge, and there was a sense that their experimental nature was somehow threatening to society.
Were you aware of any media attention focused on young people at the time?
Massive amount of media attention. I think they probably were unfair to young people because they would, as they do nowadays, I think, they take an instance and say for instance like bird flu a few years back, there was going to be a pandemic according to the media, and one swan died, I think, up in Scotland. And I think they used to blow things out of all proportion. But there was times when they had mods and rockers beating the living daylight out of each other on Brighton Beach, and that wasn't blown up. It just pointed the cameras and saw the violence that was going on. So there was a lot of violence in the 60s, and the media reported that. But sometimes it was very unfair, very sexist. If a girl was seen with a mini skirt on, that was main news,
The mods and rockers, there was certainly a moral panic around them, and they were castigated by a judge and described as petty hoodlums, I think the word was, petty hoodlums, who kind of hunted people in packs like rats. So, there was very strong kind of identifications there with the media and moral panic.
The relationship between young people and the media, well, it's all a big circle, really. I think the media write about young people and they put them into little boxes and generalise about them and make stereotypes out of them, and then young people read about it and they think, oh, that's a good idea, I want to be one of those or one of those. So they're both feeding off one another, I think.
I think the media affects our opinions of everything. I think it's extremely influential on the way people think, and I know that there was a lot of concern around the time of the Tottenham riots and the London riots that ended up going nationwide about the way young people were being portrayed in the media then as, lawless and wild and criminalised. So I think that can have a very, very powerful effect, and I think it's something that dropped off once that coverage finished, but I think that coverage for a time really affected people's views of young people. And I think if a situation like that arose again, where there was a lot of negative publicity for a group of young people or a minority of young people, again, that could affect the wider view of young people in society, because people are influenced by what they see on the television and hear on the radio and read in the newspapers.
Yeah, well, the trouble is that a lot of people now actually look at the minority and treat the majority as the minority.
Yes.
And that is, they are frightened of actually approaching anybody now. And it's the same with the teenagers now. They're terrified to approach an elderly person because they don't know what to expect. They don't know how they're going to react to what's actually happening.
I think always the older generation are frightened of what they don't understand. I mean, I think before I started photographing teddy boys and skinheads, I think I probably would have been a bit scared of those groups, scared about talking to them, or, you know. But once you start talking to people in these groups and they see you're sincere and you don't try and patronise them, if you've got a good reason to engage them in the first place, more often than not they're fine, and they're no different from anybody else really, apart from the fact that they like to express themselves through the way they dress.
Well, the 70s, probably the most colourful and well-known subculture was probably the punk subculture of the 1970s, and they were associated with a strong DIY, do-it-yourself culture. So many of them made their own clothes, and their music was also short, staccato, and almost apprenticeship-like in its form. So the idea was if you could play 3 chords, that was good enough. It was just about taking part that was important, and their hairstyles and their attitude was probably what was most shocking for the rest of society. Probably the skinhead movement has probably been seen as the most kind of racist, but interestingly enough, it had 2 waves, and the first wave of early skinheads actually drew heavily upon black and particularly Jamaican culture. So they were into two-tone music, they were into ska. Many of them, like the shaven-headed look with boots, was actually part of a Jamaican protest culture, but a lot of that became taken over and fused with white working class culture. So the second wave of skinheads actually took that on round issues of race and racism.
When I was photographing skinheads, that was obviously quite dangerous at times, and some of my experiences then weren't particularly enjoyable at the time. Looking back, I survived okay. You know, I think it wasn't too bad, but I was with a group of skinheads once in Southend, and someone walked over to me and kicked me in the balls without even saying hello, for no reason. Luckily, he didn't catch me right, and then he tried to take my camera. But I just think he was a little bit of a nutter. And yeah, but when I was photographing skinheads, I did get myself into a few difficulties. I was saved being beaten up several times by one particular skinhead who was like the king of the skinheads back then. But you know, I think I had a guardian angel sitting on my shoulder the whole time.
Doing no harm, you may think, just hanging around.
But too many of them end up here in the magistrate's court. And last year, nearly a third of the offences committed in the city were committed by young people under 16 years.
One of the chief problems, which always makes the headlines, is that of mugging and violence. We asked some young people in the city centre what they thought about this particular problem.
Well, I was walking up Shields Road one night and I'd been for a drink with my friends, you know. And 3 lads, skinheads, jumped on us. Well, the policeman must have been nearby, come straight over. And 2 of the lads ran away. I was fighting with the other one. And I tried to explain to the policeman that I was jumped on, but he done me for drunk and disorderly, as well as doing the...
Were you drunk?
Well, I had a few pints, but I wasn't drunk. I was just defending myself.
I think a lot of the problems that we have to face at the moment are to do with the breakdown that we've seen in community life. And I don't mean simply family life, but community life in general.
Oh, I think it's inbuilt in all children to rebel against some things at some time or another. It's something you've, let's say, got to ride with the storm.
Some interesting subcultures in the 80s, some kind of continued on from the 70s, so we saw like post-punks come in, but we also saw the rise and birth of kind of new romantics, and these kind of captured the zeitgeist of 80s consumerism in a Thatcherite era, where people kind of adorned very fancy clothes. Some of them looked back to the past, so there were lots of frills, a pirate look kind of came in, and elements of consumerism kind of abounded in that particular style. But alongside that, I mean, you was also in the 80s, you also had high youth unemployment at certain moments, and alongside that were a group called the Casuals, who were associated with football hooliganism and would wear tracksuits and particular kind of branded items that and were linked to violence. So the 80s were quite complicated in terms of a range of different youth subcultures that were trying to inch out different niches within subculture.
My teenage life was sort of a borderline point between Thatcher and her subsequent governments under the Tories, moving on to Tony Blair. And when that came along, everything sort of seemed, it was like an open pot, money was available, there were jobs going, there was a future, you know. And it seemed to be a big changing point, and I think it was quite a hopeful time when I was growing up, especially in my late teens, you know, turning 18, 19 time.
Young people's attitudes to politics probably have changed. Now I think there were a lot of people that were quite politically active, and I'm getting the impression that there aren't so many now. I think there's people think that they can't really affect things.
My teenage years will be recorded more on what happened to other people, whereas in the 60s maybe, like I say, there were recordings of fights on the beaches between people, there were protests and standing up. My teenage years would probably be more snapshots, images of what happened around my time. So going from Adamant and U2 in the music scene, and Margaret Thatcher, and you know, all these images. Even Getty have just said this, you know, are allowing free access to 60,000 images online now. That's what my teenage years are marked as, is images, snapshots of what happened, and not particularly what happened to a group of people or a way of life as such, I don't believe anyway.
I think at the time it was more delineated, there were more marked differences between the different youth cultures. So there were punks and psychobillies and grebos and goths and metalers and ravers and trendies, and there were lots of discrete groups which I'm not sure exist now. I know that now they have kind of emos and goths and people who like dance music, but I'm not sure there's quite the variety and quite the distinct groups that there were at the time.
I think probably the biggest intervention that happened in the 90s was kind of rave subculture. So this kind of probably started in the late 80s with acid house and came into the 90s. And probably its most radical element was that you no longer had to, you know, be looking for a sexual partner to go on the dance floor. So there was, you know, that was a kind of quite a significant change, and many raves were held in outdoors in informal environments, passed on through word of mouth, and very rapidly that again became a source of moral panic. So in 1994 the Criminal Justice Bill was passed, which stopped any kind of gatherings involving more than 10 people that were playing music, and I think the term was something like to syncopated beats that were faster than a certain number of beats per hour. So it was basically all about targeting this group.
If you were a goth, the general trend was to be quite miserable all the time, very white of face, to kind of hide behind your hair a bit like this, and perhaps kind of like walk in a slightly more floppy way, not really look before you cross the road, head down a lot. So there was a lot in terms of kind of mannerisms and culture and everything else, apart from just simply the music that you listened to.
Many youngsters can be seen around the city during school and working hours. What are they doing there?
I think what we have seen is a lot of retracing of older subcultures. So we've seen mods come back into fashion, we've seen a goth revival, and often this is selective and taking parts or elements from the past and kind of reworking them in the present. But we've also seen the mainstreaming of youth. So youth are probably now more mainstream than ever before. Most of them are consumers and have a different set of values. So there's now a feeling that whereas subculture might have been about, might have been more grassroots in the past, you can now buy into a subculture through merchandise and so forth, t-shirts, sweatshirts, etc. It's less DIY, and also the internet has changed a lot of this. So social networking has had a big influence upon how you might do subculture. Okay, you can do it by setting up networks, joining people and groups and so on. So that's probably a huge change that we've seen in the noughties.
I see that teenagers nowadays are quite diverted, as I say, by their iPads and their online gaming, and people tend to be our teenagers tend to be a bit more friendly to each other. I think the keyboard warrior thing is sort of inversed a little bit, in that the people who you can't see, you don't make a decision by their appearance, so you make friends with people online quite easily, and you find that you've actually got things in common with each other. So I think it's probably a little bit of an easier life.
And yeah, it's so much better now. There's instant access to information and a way of getting what you want to do out. If I wanted to do a poster, for instance, supposing I was a graphic artist, I wanted to do a poster. When I was a teenager, it would be almost impossible to do it if I just had an idea. Now you can do it on a computer in half an hour and the world can see it.
My dad says that when he was a teenager my age, things are a lot different. It's like there's no technology as much as we've got today. So.
Yeah, my dad used to say stuff like, I was on the golf course when I was your age and I wasn't on the computer. He's always like outside.
And then when the televisions came out, the black and whites, and you used to have them in the cabinets. You used to open the cabinet.
The cabinet was massive. When you opened it, the screen was only about
7-inch screen. 7-inch screen.
I think it was 9.
But I'll guarantee you, to the end of the night, when it came to 10 o'clock, the television cut off. That was it.
Nothing on
but
at all.
You used to sit there and watch
the
these
dogs
dogs go off.
I feel like they had to entertain themselves differently, but there's still the teenage stereotype.
I think that like teenagers now are probably like better behaved, if you know what I mean, than teenagers back then, cause now there's like most people are like in the house, to be honest, and then, but back then there would have been like all the teenagers were on the streets, so I reckon that there would have been like more crime and stuff back then. You know, general morality is so much better now than it was. I mean, when I was growing up, we were growing up in basically part of West London that was almost all white, and people were very negative towards differences, I'd say. I'm not saying everybody was racist, but there was a lot of minorities were looked down on. I don't think that's the case now. Also, we live in a much more multicultural society, especially London. I think London's the most multicultural city in the world. I think that there is groups, but they're not really treated any differently unless that they choose to be treated differently by staying out the way of other people and stuff.
I don't really know, there is the groups in school, that walk around with each other, but then they're not exiled, everyone is a team in this school.
Yeah, there is different sort of groups that walk around as friends, but I wouldn't say necessarily that they've got names such as goths.
There are definite groups in school, but it's not really a set divide. I mean, as you go through school, friendship groups change, so there isn't really a Chava group, a goth group. It's sort of just that's that set of friends, and then they can change. So I don't think there are set groups.
I'm not aware of a very identifiable division of youth subcultures like I used to see in my day, perhaps because I'm older now, where I used to be able to say quite easily, he's a punk and he's a metaler and he's a goth and he's a crusty. I don't notice those divisions being as obvious now.
I think films tend to like exaggerate these like little cliques, like especially ones from the 90s as well, like the high school movies about the American ones. They tend to make those like social divisions within school, like, you know, like the sporty people, or like the geeks or whatever. But that's not really realistic.
So it seems that, for previous generations, having a distinct identity was important to teenagers, who placed great value on belonging to larger groups or subcultures. However, we have found that young people today do not share this desire for difference. Identities are more fluid, groups more open. Despite this shift away from a reliance on defined, exclusive subcultures, our research and interviews seem to show a distorted media portrayal, which highlights conflict where there is no conflict. TV and movies give the false impression that teenagers are still split into distinct groups which are openly hostile to each other and the rest of society. In fact, today's teenagers appear to be more accepting of differences than ever before.